Začnemo, gremo na akademski 15.
Noah, nas je klele, presegamo v bistvu dovoljeno število, tako da prej, ko začneš, boljš bo.
A kar začnem.
Dej, evo, ti mahamo iz Doma kulture.
No, super, maham nazaj.
Evo nas.
Thank you so much for hosting me, for setting this up. I want to welcome everyone who's joining us this evening. This will be fun. Academic lectures aren't supposed to be fun, right? But if you're at home in your pajamas like I am, and I hope most of you in your pajamas, then I always think that's the best way to learn. My favorite class at university was my architecture class, which met Tuesday nights from 7 to 9 p.m. And we would all show up in our pajamas. That was sort of the official uniform. And we would order pizza delivered. And we'd sit and eat pizza with our feet up on the table in our pajamas and talk about architecture. And this is absolutely the best way to learn. So we're going to have a virtual version of that. So my relationship with architect Jožetu Plečniku goes back to 2000 when I was first traveling around Europe on a Eurailing trip where you buy one of those train tickets and you can travel as much as you like for a period of time. And Ljubljana was one of the destinations. And when I visited it, I was immediately struck by the exceptional architecture that I saw there. But I didn't know who had made it. I didn't know that it was all by a single architect. I really had no expectations about Ljubljana. And I think most people who have an aesthetic bent to them, when they first visit Ljubljana, they're really struck by the architecture, how lovely it is, particularly some of these prominent public buildings and public spaces that it turns out, if you do a little bit of research, our friend Jožetu Plečniku designed. He is, in my opinion, by far the greatest Slovenian artist ever in any medium. Perhaps the only one who's sort of A1 level, up there with any artist or architect you can imagine in the history of art. And of course, architectural historians have been a big fan of his for ages, but we'll talk about some elements of his career, the decisions that he made, why he came to Ljubljana, and why he isn't as well known as other contemporaries of his, rough contemporaries like Antoni Gaudi or Frank Lloyd Wright. And we'll look at some of the buildings. This isn't going to be by any means complete, but we'll get started. It's a very personal view as well. If you have questions and you're joining us on Zoom, the easiest might be for you to write them in the chat, or we'll try to coordinate for people at Klub Kino maybe questions out loud afterwards in Slovene or English. Nocoj bo v angliščino, ker je bistveno lažje zame, ampak lahko vprašate v slovenščini, ni problema. Okay. On November 28th, 2018, Kanye West, the rapper and singer, tweeted about Plečnik. This was presumably after having seen his work featured at the 2018 MoMA exhibit on concrete architecture in Yugoslavia. The result was this huge swell in interest in the Slovenian architect, coupled with a good measure of confusion on the part, at least, of the American public. Who was this esoteric architect? It was an uber hipster tweet from Mr. West, one which elevated him in the minds of the intelligentsia, because those who knew already, those who were in the know, knew perfectly well who Plečnik was. We didn't need an introduction. but the rest of the world suddenly sat up and took notice. He's been the darling of architectural historians for decades, but he has remained out of the sightlines of the general public. I want you to imagine the gentleman we see here, and you see him in, I think it's his late 20s in the slide on the left, and in his 60s in the slide on the right. Who wouldn't love this man with a giant cigarette and cuddling a dog and this great beard? I immediately was taken by his aesthetic, which we'll talk about. It was very much intentional. But I want you to imagine him walking through Ljubljana in the early 1950s. A slightly hunched figure, dressed all in black, leans on a cane as he shuffles northward along the Ljubljanica River. From his home, he passes crouched willow trees, their leaves bending gently against the breeze that spins along the embankment. Above his long white whiskers bearded like an Assyrian king, below his ubiquitous tall hat, he admires his creations in the city that bears his signature as much as any city in the world can be the fruit of a single architect. Ljubljana is his city, and it is to the city's great benefit that he is its architect. He nods toward a chapel of his design in a neighborhood composed almost entirely of vegetable gardens, a medieval monastery that he converted into a concert hall, a library clad in a brick facade that undulates with projecting window bays, making it look like a sea in choppy waters. We see him at his desk in the round tower he used as an office in his idiosyncratic home, full of objets à réaction poétique, objects that provoke a poetic reaction in him as he draws up plans for his next project. He walks a street that he lined with autumnal trees and sculpted busts of his forebears. He crosses a bridge spiked with columns that support nothing but the air, only to later cross another bridge, also his, but this is not one but three separate ones, angled walkways above the water, one each for cars, pedestrians, and cyclists. He circles towards a star-shaped park, glancing up at a monastery, a promenade, and a high school, all by his hand. There's a chapter in my 2018 book called The Museum of Lost Art about lost artists. And what I mean by that is the sense that they're miraculously talented and revolutionary, but have remained for various reasons out of the sightlines of the general public and in many cases of critics as well. Plečnik is one such artist. He has remained in the shadows, recognized only by a relatively small localized audience of aficionados and architectural historians who adore him. Until, that is, fate brings someone like this into the limelight, even if fate comes from an unexpected force, like a tweet from a rapper. Part of his quote-unquote invisibility is down to the fact that solitary geniuses like Plečnik must be stumbled upon or sought out. He was never a member of any of the major movements of his time. He only flirted with secessionism, which was the major movement of his time in Vienna. He has little in common with the Bauhaus, and while he is an architect of the era of modernism, he was never involved in CIAM, Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, which was the most visible modernist movement led by the French architect, or rather Swiss architect, Le Corbusier, or the other major modernist movements that made headlines. He did not work in major architectural centers either after his student years in Vienna. He was idiosyncratic, unique, a revolutionary without a revolution. The numerous portrait photographs of Plečnik, as well as accounts from his friends and relatives, show a man who was rather self-consciously quirky. And I think we can see that in these photos. We'll see them in some others as well. He loved to be photographed and posed and groomed himself like some Tibetan mystic, almost always in a tall black hat with his sharp cheekbones cut above an elegant white beard that would look at home on the face of an Assyrian king. He was also a bit of a quirky guy, to say the least. He was an ascetic. He was rarely involved with women, preferring to live alone. He bathed only in cold water, and he took only the lightest of meals. In fact, his favorite meal was a single bun of bread and a glass of the very light, very sour, and if you ask me, completely awful red wine called svichuk. Deeply religious, he lived as a monk in the city, dedicated to his work and his students, with whom he spent a great deal of time, even outside the classroom. He was not interested in money, taking on numerous projects for little or no pay, particularly the construction of churches. He was a cult figure among his students and the citizens of Ljubljana, and he seemed to like it that way. Seen through today's eyes, Plečnik is hardly relegated to history, but feels very much in tune with contemporary issues in architecture, having focused on them decades before the rest of the world caught up. He was a green architect concerned with using local materials, often hyperlocal stone, such as a stone quarried within a few kilometers of a building site. He sought to create what today we would call sustainable architecture, recycling materials as often as he could and creating in the most cost-effective way that he could, sacrificing grandiose concepts for what was most pragmatic for those using his buildings. He was a postmodern architect decades before that term was even coined, and it is a little surprise that his widest acclaim came in the postmodern era, with a major retrospective of his work at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 1986, which is what really introduced him to a bigger audience beyond Vienna, Prague, and Ljubljana. In 2018, he was one of the featured architects in the MoMA exhibit on concrete architecture in Yugoslavia. And in 2020, 33 liturgical chalices of his design were displayed at the Vatican, so his renown continues to grow. Plečnik's career saw him choose to move from a point of highest potential as the top student under Otto Wagner in Vienna, which was the premier architecture academy in Central Europe at the time, to pursue a career that was essentially out of the limelight. Rather than remain in Vienna, the center of the artistic world in the 1900s, or to seek employment in a high visibility city, such as Paris, which was home of the new modernist movement of the time led by Le Corbusier, Plečnik worked first in Prague, a Slavic cultural center, but still outside the sightlines of haute criticism. He then returned to Slovenia, his homeland, which was always his plan, it seemed, to construct buildings in a style that would come to define the architecture of his new nation, only recently independent from the Habsburgs and not yet subsumed within Yugoslavia. This return home, which seems to have always been his ultimate intention, risked a sort of career martyrdom, as Slovenia was perceived as an overlooked cultural backwater. In fact, Plečnik was disparaging of Ljubljana. Today, Ljubljana is so vibrant and such a wonderful place, it's hard to imagine. But he actually said in a letter to his brother Andrei, "Ljubljana is so unbearably ugly. Is this ugliness an expression of the human soul? If so, something strange is going on with us." He was dedicated to Slovenia, but often despite what he saw around him. His agenda became the beautification and elevation of his homeland through architecture. Plečnik consciously chose to sacrifice fame and prominence in order to work from home. He might have hoped, but could not have known, that the shifts in world politics and international accessibility would bring his work into the light, albeit posthumously. Since his death, he has been embraced by postmodernists and has finally received well-deserved recognition. So much so that you can find Plečnik anything. In fact, I am drinking tea out of a Plečnik-themed cup. So you name it, you can find it. We got Plečnik candles, Plečnik tea. He's really become a brand name now, but that was a long time coming. So let's trace his career a little bit before we zoom in on some of the buildings. Yes, a couple of other notes. One of the things that's interesting, okay, why am I talking about Plečnik so much? Because I'm an art historian specialized in art crime. This beautiful book, which I cannot take any credit for its beauty, was my PhD dissertation, and I finished my PhD at University of Ljubljana writing about Plečnik, and the book was published in English and Slovene by the City Museum and Totaliteta Publishing House, and it won an award for design, not for the text. I've actually been involved in multiple books that won awards, but for design, not the text. I don't know if that's a lesson that I should learn something from, but there you go. So this is why I'm talking about him with such enthusiasm. I came across him just as I described at the beginning in 2000 as a student traveling through Europe and really taken with his architecture. And I was taken enough that I came back to Ljubljana and asked to meet with the man who was at the time the head of the Architecture Museum, Peter Krečić, who would later become my dissertation supervisor. And we got to chatting, and he said he had this great idea for a dissertation, and maybe I would know someone interested in doing it. And I thought for about 2 weeks, and I decided I would do it. And it was about the critical reception to Plečnik at home and abroad, and why he made the decisions that he did. And Dr. Krečić wanted someone to do it who was a foreigner, because he said it was very complicated for Slovenes to write about their own architect. And I started to understand why, because there's a tendency to idolize him and put him up on a pedestal. And that's, on the one hand, understandable. But if someone is put up on a pedestal, it's very hard to be an objective critic of their work and to talk about things they might not have done well. There have even been some really strange ideas, like a movement to have him made into a saint, canonized. Believe it or not, he was deeply religious, but he wasn't a saintly soul, I think, in terms of qualifying. But there were attempts to find out if he had performed at least 2 miracles, one during his life and one after his death, believe it or not, to try to get him sanctified. He has aspects of his life that people don't seem to want to talk about, like the fact that he never wanted to get married, not because he was so completely religious, but he was just married to his work, as he joked, but he was involved with women like Alice Masaryk on the right, who's the daughter of Tomáš Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia, and this pharmacist on the left, Emilia Fon. So he was not a complete monk in all senses. But it's a little bit funny, because I understand that it's a complicated dynamic among Slovenes to talk about their greatest artist, and it's sometimes easier for someone to come from abroad and look at it with fresh eyes without any baggage along with it. One of the reasons that Ljubljana is so Plečnik-tastic is that there was an unfortunate earthquake in 1895, and that earthquake leveled about 15% of the center of Ljubljana. And because of that, it was a relatively blank slate with a lot of public works projects that needed to be done. And thankfully, in the following decades, Plečnik was available as an architect. He was presented by an art historian named Francis Delay, who lived in Kamniku, where I live now, who was his biggest proponent as a critic, and by Matko Prelošek, who was one of the heads of the city works, and by Ivan Hribar, the famous mayor of Ljubljana. He was supported by all the right people at the right time, and so he has an unusual percentage of his projects actualized in Ljubljana. Because he was by far the best architect available, and they really needed it at the time. But I just wanted to show you, I'm terrible with PowerPoint slides. I don't really know how to make them. So I'm experimenting with various effects, like this one that looks like I tore a piece out of the screen. I'm not sure if this works so well. I want you to be able to see how beautiful his drawings were, absolutely at the level of any artist you can imagine. He was a wonderful draftsman. And this is the house that his brother Andrei, who was a priest, wound up buying for the family. And when he bought this house, Plečnik was still abroad, and he decided that this was his opportunity to come and live in Ljubljana. He didn't really know if he would be able to find work there, because as I mentioned, he considered Ljubljana a cultural backwater, some place that wouldn't appreciate or have opportunities for his architecture necessarily. And this was also before University of Ljubljana was founded in 1919, that gave him the potential to teach. Before that, he wasn't sure what he would do for work. But when Andrei bought this house, which is still Plečnikova hića, Plečnik's house, the museum now today, he felt like he had a home to return to. We see him in the photo on the right. He's the young one looking, I guess, Plečnik-like on the left side above his mother. Andrei, his brother, is wearing the priestly garments. But our story really begins in Vienna. So Vienna was where promising Slovenes went to study until the university opened in 1919. And then for some time afterwards, that was still the primary destination. And as is evident from abundant archival material, at the encouragement of his family, the 22-year-old Plečnik submitted a small portfolio of drawings to Otto Wagner. Otto Wagner is the guy on the right. The guy on the left is Gottfried Semper, who was the primary theorist who Wagner and Plečnik admired, and they tried to integrate his theories into their work, and Plečnik was probably the most successful. And architectural theory is probably the most boring thing that I could be talking to you about, so I'm not going to do much about it, but much of my dissertation is looking at how Semper's theories were implemented by Plečnik, and how a clash of opinions about how to interpret this theorist is eventually what pushed Wagner and Plečnik apart. So when he was 22, Plečnik submitted this portfolio of drawings to Otto Wagner in hopes of being accepted as a student at the Wagner Academy in the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, which was the premier place to study architecture in all of Europe at the time. But he was unable to keep up with his peers at first. So Wagner offered him to work as an assistant for a year and then reapply. He did so and eventually became the best of Wagner's students, winning the prestigious Rome Prize for his diploma project, which allowed him to travel on a paid holiday to Italy for having the best dissertation among the students. Wagner's approach was to educate international students and then return them to their countries of origin. But Wagner's admiration for Plečnik would lead the master architect to consider that Plečnik might actually be his successor as professor of architecture at the premier architecture academy in Europe at the time. The issue was really one of ethnicity. Plečnik was thrice nominated and thrice rejected, mostly because Archduke Franz Ferdinand personally blocked his appointment, probably because he felt that a Slav should not hold the highest architectural seat in Austria. Also, Plečnik had mocked the design of a pet project of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's. Archduke Franz Ferdinand had mocked one of Plečnik's designs, a church in Ottakring in a suburb of Vienna. And the two didn't get along very well. There might have been personal reasons. There was some talk that Plečnik chose not to buy stone from a quarry that was owned by the Archduke's family. It was complicated, but it is most likely that it was not considered acceptable for a Slav to have the highest architectural professorship in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. So the increasingly pro-Germanic and anti-foreign atmosphere of Vienna leading up to the Balkan War and the First World War created a mood of unwelcome for the likes of the Slavic Plečnik. As German nationalism rose, foreigners felt compelled to react with overt nationalistic allegiance to their own countries. For architects, the discussion of what makes for a national architectural style came to the fore. How could an architect design products that feel of his country, the praise of which would glorify his homeland? And one of the things that I believe firmly and came out of my studies is that really Slovenia did not have a national architectural style. If we think of anything beyond like Kozolci and Toplady, if you know what those are. But Plečnik's own style became what we associate with the Slovenian national style. Plečnik seems to have been on a noble personal quest to give something back to his homeland. When he convinced himself that he had failed to bring lasting notoriety to Slovenia during his Vienna tenure, his thoughts turned to the reconstruction of the earthquake-damaged Ljubljana and a chance to give Slovenia the gift of a loving, beautiful new architecture that would embody his nation. So what was the next step after Vienna? It looked, and if Plečnik had been given Wagner's post as Wagner wanted, he probably would have stayed there and he would have been teaching at the Fine Arts Academy in Vienna, and that would have been the elevation of his career, and it would have remained such. But feeling like he couldn't remain in Vienna because of this anti-Slavic sentiment, he wanted to go elsewhere, and he was able to get a job in Prague. Prague was at the time the cultural zenith among Slavic countries. So feeling ever less welcome in pro-Teutonic Vienna, Plečnik sought shelter and a sense of place with a community of fellow Slavs. In Prague, Plečnik would be embraced for being a Slav and would be given absolute architectural control over what is really his grandest and greatest project, the renovation of Prague Castle. Plečnik came to Prague hailed as one of the most talented of any Slavic architects. With the First World War, as one nation pulled inward in these sort of fists of nationalism, other nations were forced to do the same. Artists were no longer simply artists, but artists of their homeland. Their art, therefore, became an expression of that homeland, not of a universal art that transcended borders, as we like to talk about today. But Plečnik put himself wholeheartedly into any project he undertook. He took Prague Castle Commission and gave the new Czechoslovak president, Tomáš Masaryk, exactly what he wanted: the conversion of a former feudal complex, because remember, Prague Castle was, I think, a 15th century structure, and he transformed it, renovated it into a new cradle for the new democracy of the Czechoslovak state. And we see some pictures of it here, including on the far right, you have what's referred to, if you go and visit Prague Castle now, as Plečnik Hall, which has these beautiful details. And I want to pause for a moment and talk about what are some of the architectural elements that make a work identifiable as by Plečnik. With Prague Castle, the primary puzzle was how to create an architecture that would be symbolic of a brand new nation, yet at the same time inspire the sense that it was grounded in the shining nations of the past, and it had potential for indefinite longevity, something that he would seek to replicate later on a citywide scale in Ljubljana. While working on the castle, Plečnik became friends with Alice Masaryk, the president's daughter and a great intellectual in her own right. A romance developed, and one story goes that Alice was so in love with Plečnik that when he kissed her once, she fainted. She would be one of a handful of women in Plečnik's life, but he always refused to marry, stating that he was, quote, already married to architecture. But he always intended to return to Ljubljana. And when his brother Andrei bought a house there, when Ljubljana opened a university where he could teach, he saw the opportunity to do so. So what are some of the architectural elements that I see and I say that looks Plečnik-like? Well, one of the things that he loved is detail for detail's sake. And he loved architectural elements, whether or not they had a function. And this is the opposite of what we tend to think of as 20th century architecture and modernism in particular, where the phrase is form follows function, meaning that what the object or building looks like should be only related to how it's being used. Well, Plečnik was having none of that. And one of the issues with Plečnik, one of the reasons that he's not as well known as he should be, is that he was absolutely unique. He had many students, but none of them were anywhere near as good as he was. And he was unique enough that he was unable to start a revolution that had followers emulating his work. He also wasn't interested in creating movements. He was interested in just making work. And he also didn't join any movements. So he's a unique sort of lighthouse in the mist, which means that it's harder for him to be spotted as opposed to a large enclave of architects of varying levels of prominence who are all working in a similar style. So in him, one of the things that I was immediately fascinated with is if you're an art historian, you can play this name that period game. When you look at Plečnik's architecture, you can spot things from all different art historical periods, geographies, and he just picked what he liked. But when he does it, because he was such a unique genius, it all seems to work. If you and I were to just pick random architectural features and throw them together, then it's unlikely to have a pleasing effect. So what are some of the things he liked? Well, he collected discarded antiquities and elements of former buildings, and he liked to reintegrate them. And he loved columns. He has columns on columns on columns, whether or not you need columns. He even has columns that don't support anything. Columns that don't support anything are totally absurd, but they're beautiful as objects, and he liked that. So you can see this Plečnik's Hall on the right. It looks like a forest of columns over the top, but in a way that works. But I'm going to have a little caveat, because when we say architecture works, one of the things that's really important about architecture is it's not just about facades. That's what people tend to think. But great architecture is about creating spaces. You create spaces by making facades, by making walls, by making windows, doors, and how you feel in a building is really the indication of whether it's successful or not. So I don't feel in a position to say that architecture is good or bad until I've been to the place and felt essentially the vibe of what it feels like to be there. Whether the proportions feel just right, whether you have a sense of uplift when you're walking through the space, whether things just click and it feels good or not. And that's a lot based on proportions and things that it's easy to get wrong and difficult to get right. So if you can get it right, then you can throw in as many columns as you want, it still works. So if you see an image of a building, you can have an immediate aesthetic decision. You can say, well, I don't really like the way that looks, at least superficially, but it's important not to be an absolute judge about it until you've been there. For example, when I was studying like Le Corbusier, I thought his stuff looked absolutely dreadful, horrifying, and some of his ideas, which were concepts that he never meant to actualize, like he had an idea of knocking down Notre Dame in Paris and most of the center of Paris and putting up a series of X-shaped skyscraper apartment buildings. And I just was like, oh my God, why would anybody like this guy? Why is he so famous? But once you go to some of his buildings, you realize how they work in a way that is beyond the aesthetic of the facades. So Plečnik in Prague Castle was really the epitome. That's his #1 major project. But he was Slovene. He wanted to return to his homeland, and he saw the opportunity in 1919, now that there was a university where he could be employed. So he moved from Prague back home to this new house that he shared with his brother and sister in Ljubljana. And we have some images of it here. Just threw this in case if you doubt my excessive columns doing nothing, then look no further than the Cobbler's Bridge in Ljubljana in the bottom left corner, which has these great columns. One of them has a light on it. The others are just columns, just hanging out, doing nothing in particular except looking interesting and curious and a little bit surreal, because a column's purpose is to support something above it so that you can have openings like doorways or a loggia or windows. There's nothing above it, then there's no reason for it to be there. Now, when he was traveling in Italy in particular, he would see ancient ruins where you have columns supporting nothing because the upper levels collapsed. And he just liked the way that worked, and he integrated it. I still think that Plečnik's home is the best place to get to know the man in all of his passions, preferences, and quirks, as he was entirely free to make it just the way he wished. The newly renovated museum actually just won an award a few years ago, and it's the ideal lens through which to get to know Plečnik as a human being. He slept in a round tower in a room that created an unusual visual illusion, and you can see that right in the middle of the screen, which made it appear that the round room was actually oval due to the incorporation of a prominent transverse crossbeam bisecting the ceiling. That's my fancy way of saying there was a beam across the ceiling, a round room that gave it the visual illusion of looking oval. In the Winter Garden, which you see in the top left, students would gather immediately after the Second World War to carry on lessons. So during the war, when the university was closed, he actually secretly had students come for lessons in his house. And then after the war, he would regularly have them meet in the Winter Garden, and the floor was a lapidarium, which is the Latin term for basically a gallery of stones. And he put stone samples integrated into the floor, and he could use this to pick what he would use in his projects. He had these very quirky personality traits. The bathroom adjoining his bedroom initially had no bathtub at all, as Plečnik preferred to bathe using jugs of cold water, whatever you're into, right? He followed a popular diet and health regime that was designed by a physician called Dr. Charney, and the diet featured primarily eating whole wheat bread, lots of herbal medicine, no caffeine. You can still today get barley coffee that has Dr. Charney written on it if you go to Slovenian supermarkets. And these cold water cures, the application of water at various temperatures and pressures as a curative. There appeared in Plečnik, particularly during his Ljubljana period, a sense of his seemingly self-conscious shaping as a sort of a spiritual figure. He did not preach religion, but he preached to his students dogmatic adherence to his principles, and as sort of spiritualism in the construction of architectural space. He wore all black. He cultivated that elegant, almost, Tibetan or Assyrian long white beard. He was rarely seen outdoors without his signature high-domed black hat. And while he would say that he disliked photographs of himself, he posed for a lot of them, and he was clearly aware that he was very photogenic. A quick study of the portraits he permitted show a kindly-looking grandfatherly man, but one with a sense of his own iconic self. He chose to live monastically. He refused for his own home to accept any modern conveniences. He refused to have central heating. He refused to have a modern bathroom. He refused to have a radio. He preferred to surround himself with these poetic, inspiring objects that he found. And his students, frankly, developed a sort of a cult of admiration around him, copying his drawing style, copying his handwriting, even copying the way he walked. The objects collected at his house paint a sort of interesting negative space portrait of Plečnik, the homeowner. By examining what he loved enough to display, provides insight into his personality and private tastes. And it's really fascinating just to wander through his house. One of the most striking elements is a collection of beautiful objects taken out of their normal everyday context or stripped of an integral component of their normal use. For instance, he would collect columns when he would see them at a site, or if they were excavated and they weren't going to a museum, and he would just stick them in his backyard. So let's look at a couple of his buildings in more detail. So one of the ones that I just love is the Church of St. Michael in the Marsh, Sveti Michael Barju. Even in his receipt of commissions, many of which were never realized, Plečnik styled himself as a martyr to architectural ideas at the sacrifice of actualization. So for him, the ideas of the architecture were most important. If they were actually made, that was nice, but that wasn't his main priority. He once wrote, quote, "I am not concerned about the realization. The designs are more important and more spiritual." His strong Catholic beliefs interwove with his architecture and his devout charitable proclivities. He said, for instance, that every apartment building that he built ought to contain one free apartment for a poor family. In 1922, Plečnik began to design the Church of St. Michael in the Marsh, though it was not begun until 1936 due to funding problems. For this church in Barje, a marshland on the outskirts of Ljubljana, he chose to build with concrete to make a cost-effective alternative to stone. He incorporated unusual elements that expressed his own style in his least traditional building. The roof, constructed of wood and tiled in concrete, was meant to echo Etruscan temple roofs, another of his attempt to manufacture physical evidence of a theory that is important in understanding some of the details of the architecture he built. There's a theory that was popular when he was a student called the Veneto Theory. And the basic concept is there was a false idea that it would be kind of cool if the people in Slovenia actually turned out to be Etruscan. In actuality, Slovenia was a combination of tribes, but primarily from the 6th century onward, Slavic tribe. But the idea is the older your roots, this is especially an Italian idea where there are competitions to see whose city is the oldest, because it's cooler to be founded earlier. So if you could claim that you were Etruscan and that the Veneto region, including Slovenia, adjacent to it was actually Etruscan, then this was somehow extra cool. And Plečnik liked this idea very much. Mostly he liked Etruscan architecture, and he tried to make it manifest by introducing Etruscan elements to some of the buildings that he made newly. There's no architectural validity to this theory, but it was popular at the time. So this is a combination of, this is the game that art historians with too much time on their hands like to play, spot the style, spot the geographic origins of it. This looks a lot like a Japanese Shinto shrine. It's got a roof that looks like an Etruscan temple, but it is a Catholic church. It looks a little bit like, in the inside, like stave churches that you'll see in Norway. So it's got a lot of these interesting elements, and he made decisions based on what the budget could sustain for these buildings. He was not the least bit of prima donna. One of Plečnik's very human strengths was his willingness to bend his ideology to the needs of local parishioners. When it was clear that folk traditions would ring truest in the hearts of the church constituency, Plečnik provided what he otherwise would have preferred not to. A touching example of this comes in the table placed near the altar as a depository for gifts of food in this church. Plečnik knew that most local parishioners couldn't give a tithe of money. Only they could give a portion of their own food. The church is also full of inventive, cost-effective details, and my favorite one is in the image of the right. He used Turkish coffee mills to make the lights because it was cheaper than buying lights. So literally, this is that, middle part, brass middle part, is a mill for grinding coffee to make Turkish coffee, and he made lights out of them because it was cheaper than buying lights. The church was not even completed until 1950 because of money problems, and Plečnik went unpaid for his work, and he even paid for parts of this church himself out of his pocket. Such acts are indicative of Plečnik's Catholic charity, his sense of mission to create spiritual spaces for people regardless of wages and fame. Visitors to Ljubljana cannot help but encounter the work of Plečnik. He designed an incredible number of buildings, public spaces, and even portions of the city, which had been so badly damaged by that earthquake in 1895. What Gaudi is to Barcelona, Plečnik is far more to Ljubljana and to Slovenia as a whole, for his work can be found throughout his homeland. He was far and away Slovenia's greatest artist in any medium, and Ljubljana was his greatest palette. Let's just look briefly at a few more buildings. This is NUK, the National and University Library. This is Plečnik's grandest monument in central Ljubljana. He put his plans on display for this with an accompanying study by the art historian Francis Delay in the summer of 1933. He had a sort of a rival architect at this time named Ivan Vurnik, who put together a rival study denouncing Plečnik's plans because it was too much like a Baroque palace, which is a little ironic because there actually was a Baroque palace that had been damaged in the earthquake and torn down on this site, but Plečnik got the commission. I say Vurnik was sort of a rival because I think Vurnik was intimidated by Plečnik, and Plečnik didn't really give two hoots about Vurnik because they were at completely different levels. Otto Wagner, his teacher, had designed the university library in Vienna. So this was sort of Plečnik's chance to present his own concept for such a structure, and one that distanced him from his master because it really does look quite different from Wagner's library in Vienna. It also let him throw in some Etruscan notes, and the library of this library, scholar Damian Prošek writes, quote, to display his wishful thinking that Slovenian culture had Mediterranean roots on the library building as well, he placed above the portal round ceramic vessels cast in concrete and based on Etruscan models. Plečnik was convinced that he had to start at the very beginning, that is with antiquity, if he was to liberate his people of their dependence on Roman and Germanic culture, unquote. But it was to be Plečnik's concept of what Sloveneness meant, which meant for him incorporating Etruscan elements because he quite liked the idea that Slovenes had Etruscan origins, that he felt lent a structure, a Slovene Stimmung. Now, I don't speak German, but I got a few words here and there, and one that I love is Stimmung. Stimmung is hard to translate, but it basically means a vibe. So He was once asked, what is Slovenian architecture? And he said, I don't know, but when I crossed the border from Austria into Slovenia, I sense the Slovene Stimmung, the vibe of Sloveneness. And my question for you that you can think about is maybe, do you get a vibe of Sloveneness? Do you feel the Stimmung, and what do you associate with it architecturally or aesthetically? And the most obvious thing that people like to say are kozolci, with those hay racks, or toplars, the double height hay racks. But that doesn't really count. That's not really architecture. For me, it's Plečnik's buildings, and there's no building that precedes him that I feel is sufficiently iconic and Slovene. Part of that has to do with the fact that Slovenia was occupied by imported aristocrats, imported bureaucrats from Habsburg and Austro-Hungary, and with their architectural styles as well. And Plečnik was really the first proper Slovene to provide a Stimmung that we now associate with Ljubljana. There was also this kind of quirky thing. Plečnik had the idea to revive the spirit of classical Athens in Ljubljana. And so he added things like epitaphs and allegories and hermae to the walls of the monumental front stairs of this library. So these are details that would appear in an ancient Athenian building. He ultimately removed many of the planned Athenian elements of the library, though his idea that Ljubljana could be revived along humanistic lines as a quote-unquote new Athens would actually play out to astonishing extent. The library does retain a monumental sense. I'm going to call it Hellenism, which is technically the term, but it looks like it's an echo of an ancient Greek building. And yet at the same time, it doesn't look exactly like any Greek structure. And this is something that Plečnik did really well, and that other people who are less skilled can't get away with. He managed to create works that give the vibe of past periods without making pastiches. So he didn't copy and paste. He didn't just, sample elements and stick them all together. He took all these elements, absorbed them, and made his own thing. And that's really very hard to do. One of the things that's a weird surprise, coincidence, fate, whatever you like to call it, is Plečnik was able to produce an astonishing number of projects in Ljubljana that would have fit in a Greek polis, a Greek city. So he could never have actually been certain that this would be the case, but there are two kind of weird coincidences that some scholars have noted. One is, if you look at a map of Ljubljana and highlight the Plečnik buildings and draw a straight line out from Plečnik's house towards the stadium, most of the buildings he was commissioned to do pass through that line. Now, there's no way you could have planned this. It's just a weird coincidence. But he can walk almost in a straight line and pass through almost all the buildings that he designed in Ljubljana. It's a little bit weird. The other is that the primary buildings that you would find in a Greek city, like a stadium, like Central Market, like a cemetery, like a temple, mount, all of these were buildings that he wound up getting commissions for, like an academy, you name it. So it's a little bit odd that he was able to have so many of these buildings that we associate with Greek cities, that he was able to get commissions for them and really create Ljubljana as this concept of a new Athens. This is one of my favorite things he did. This is the sluice gate to the Ljubljanica River. What's a sluice gate? It controls how much water flows in the part of the river that goes through the city. And it has got all sorts of little details that are tons of fun. It's got, you can spot ancient Greek, Egyptian architectural elements, Etruscan architectural elements, Mannerist and Baroque architectural elements. It's loads of fun to play. If I had an architectural history class to teach in Ljubljana, I would give this as the surprise pop quiz and ask for an analysis of what Plečnik's inspirations were in terms of period and geography for different details, because you name it, he's got it. Here's another example of, you want columns, we got columns. This is Plečnik's version of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. This is the entrance to Žale. Žale is the main cemetery in Ljubljana. It's a city of the dead. It's got some wonderfully designed mausolea in it. This is the main monumental entrance. And you have so many more columns than you actually need that, well, that's a lot of columns, but it works when he handles them. And it works beautifully to walk through them. It feels like you're walking through this heavenly forest, and it's a very beautiful place to be. The biggest project that Plečnik never actually had made was what he called his Cathedral of Freedom. And here you see his drawing of it. It was meant to be a new building for the Assembly of the People's Republic of Slovenia. For the now elderly Plečnik, by the time he designed this must have been a dream assignment. What could have been more indicative of the strength and independence of his beloved nation than its parliament building? After having used his architectural prowess to elevate the capital city as best he could, and as much as local government would permit his imaginative contributions, he now had an opportunity to design its crown, not only of Ljubljana, but the seat of independence of all Slovenia. In Plečnik's first study, he thought to integrate this Slovenian parliament building into the hill on which the medieval castle is perched. So his first idea, and he probably knew this wasn't going to wash, was to actually knock down a section of Castle Hill, part of the forested slope of it, and build this building on it. And the building, which you can probably see, it looks like an upside down ice cream cone, but a very elegant one. It was going to have this totally striking, totally unique, conical tower in the center that would have had what's called a heliocoidal design. So a spiral getting smaller and smaller and tighter up to the top on the inside. It would have been completely remarkable. And this would have been Ljubljana's architectural icon. I talked about this. I hosted a TV program for RTV that you can find on their website about Plečnik, and talked about it there. And I've written about this for various Slovene magazines. But Ljubljana doesn't have an architectural icon, which makes it harder for foreigners and tourists to fix it in their mind. Probably the closest thing is one of the statues of the dragons on the Dragon Bridge. That's okay. For Slovenia, Lake Bled is probably the iconic image, but most cities have a building, like Paris has Notre Dame or the Eiffel Tower or the Arc de Triomphe. Berlin has the Brandenburg Gates. Barcelona has Gaudi's Sagrada Familia. And it just makes it easier to fix the place in the imagination of people who don't live there and don't know it intimately. And this would have been that for Ljubljana. Ljubljana really doesn't have that now. There are plenty of small, charming cities with nice castles on hilltops, so that doesn't quite do it. There's no other building that is as completely unique and striking as this one would have been. So it's a shame that it was never built. Plečnik knew he could never convince the government to go ahead with such a dramatic plan as to basically interfere with the Castle Hill. But of his theoretical Slovenian parliament building, Damjan Pirošek wrote, quote, "This was the true Slovenian Acropolis." And this is another example of him designing elements that would have appeared in a Greek polis, of which he had dreamed right at the beginning of the century when he designed a monument to crown a city on the model of an ancient Egyptian temple, which was one of his early drawings when he was sort of fantasizing as a student. The most striking architectural feature was this conical tower, and it would have been supported by 12 tilted monumental columns going all the way up it. The columns would have been partially painted, which is a reference to what at the time was a relatively recent architectural discovery, that sculptures and public buildings in ancient Athens, which were long assumed to have been faced only in shining natural white marble, had actually been brightly painted. Plečnik had experimented with tilted columns in various drawings, but this would have been the one to actualize it. But the building was never executed. One of the alternative plots was to put it in Tivoli Park, which you can see on the right side of the screen where it would have been located. but it was never made. It's unfortunate. I still think that maybe they should make it. It would have been very cool to do so. Here's a wooden model of it. On the left is a wooden model of what was called the Butcher's Bridge. There was some talk of building this to his design, which I think would have been great. Instead, in Ljubljana, they built that glass bridge with the weird sculptures and where people attach all of the padlocks. I think this would have been much lovelier. And I think there's nothing wrong with building from blueprint something that was never built during the lifetime by your greatest architect, but that wasn't what they opted for. I'd like to finish today talking just a little bit about Plečnik in Kamnik. Plečnik came to Kamnik. Kamnik is where I live now, so that's why I'm partial to it. And this talk is brought to you by Kamnik Tourism, so thank you to them. So Kamnik is where the Stele family lived, and Francis Stele, the art historian, was one of Plečnik's best friends. So he would often come, take the train up from Ljubljana to visit the Stele family. The Stele family still have a candle shop in the center of Kamnik with some candles that were designed by Plečnik. And in the middle of the 20th century, the iconic building in Kamnik was a building that's no longer there. It would have stood right where this photo was taken. It was called Kamniški dom. And if you see old archival photos, it looks spectacular. It was a big manor house. But it was run by the Catholic Church. And when the socialist government was objecting to people being too absorbed in Catholicism, and there was some damage done to the building due to an earthquake, then they demolished it rather than fixing it up. And this was apparently hugely upsetting for people in Kamnik at the time. It was the building that they were proudest of, and it had been knocked down. You can still see some remnants of it. It's kind of weird. I don't know if you can see it in this photo, but in the middle bottom part of the photo, there's this angled roof that shoots up diagonally to the right. If you go down to the middle level of it, you can see a patchwork of old tiles. Some of them are blue. In this picture, it's hard to see that. Some of them are sort of tan colored. Those blue tiles were on the bathroom wall of this Kamniški dom. So what you're seeing was one wall of one of the bathrooms of this building that no longer exists there. When it was knocked down, you know, Kamniški folks were up in arms, and to try to basically apologize to them and get them to stop complaining, they said, we're going to commission Plečnik to redo our main square. He made some designs for it. Most of them were not executed. One was executed by some of his students, and that you see here, newly cleaned, the facade that looks, that is on the left side, that is decorated with the maroon colored elements. And below that, there is this cafe that has, you can see curlicue look like acanthus leaves coming out of vases, which is kind of a Greek or Etruscan style decoration that was designed by Plečnik and executed by one of his students. But there was a plan for him to redo the whole main square, which he never did. He did quite a few buildings in Kamnik and around Kamnik. For example, he did the hunting lodge of King Alexander of Yugoslavia in Kamniška Bistrica. One of his students did the central of the train stations in Kamnik. My favorite space is what I'm going to close with now, and that is the Chapel of the Holy Sepulchre, or Sveti Grob, which is in the Franciscan Church in Kamnik. Now, if you're going to visit one Plečnik building, you probably want to go to his house. If you're going to visit two of them, then you should go to this tiny little chapel, because to me, it is the perfect example of everything that Plečnik does well. It is rich with symbolism, and it presents elements that refer to Christ's death and resurrection in a combination of architecture, design elements, inscription, controlled lighting, and sculpture that demonstrates Plečnik's love for historical approaches like Baroque symbolism, his willingness to work within existing structures and to honor them, and his skill in the design of rooms, not just entire buildings. So the Chapel of the Holy Sepulchre, and what you see on the right is a decorative, non-functional Greek-looking vase made out of a solid local stone that is flanking the entrance to this little chapel, which is on the side of the main chapel of this church. So it was built in the Franciscan Church between 1952 and 1954, and there was a priest there, a guy named Martin Perez, who was instrumental in bringing Plečnik to this project, as well as a renovation of a nearby church in Stranje. In this chapel, we have what art historians call Gesamtkunstwerk. Again, I don't know German, but this is one of the terms that I do know because we use it in English too. It means a complete work of art in which all aspects of the space, architecture, sculpture, painting, furniture, design, lighting, are unified in purpose and usually designed by the same person to create an immersive three-dimensional experience for the visitor. The lighting, for example, is built into the walls. I think I have that here on the right, to look like stars in the night sky, like the stars that the shepherds and the three magi followed to Bethlehem to pay homage to the newborn Jesus. The sconces for the lights, though, look like military helmets, which was intentional since this was just after the Second World War. The space is named after the tomb in which Jesus was placed after his death, but the room is meant to represent his complete lifespan in a single space. This is what I think is so cool about it. It's sort of like an A to Z of Catholic mysticism in one space. So above the altar, we have these sloped wooden beams that resemble the roof of a stable, like the one in Bethlehem where Jesus was born. There's this monolithic stone tabernacle. That's the big stone thing on the table of the altar. And it was made of Plečnik's favorite stone, which is called petek. And it recalls the stone that supposedly was wheeled in front of Jesus's tomb to seal the entrance, and which was moved aside after 3 days when they discovered that his body had gone missing. The walls are covered in sgraffito, which is the Italian term for carved patterns in walls. It can be text, it can be images. And they have symbolic meaning, including implements used in Christ's passion, like the scourge with which he was whipped and the holy nails of the crucifixion. Christ is represented most clearly on the wall opposite the altar in this crucifix. Visually, the altar, recalling the space in which he was born. So this is the altar that recalls the space in which he was born, as well as his tomb, is connected to the crucifix, which is directly opposite it. So you follow this line that you see on the left of these grapevines and grapes, and it goes to the crucifix, which was actually a Baroque sculpture that was part of the church's collection that he integrated into his own design. So the idea that the altar is connected to the crucifix by a vine that spans the length of the ceiling is on purpose, and frankly, everything is on purpose. That's why it's interesting. It's like a visual puzzle that we can unpack. Grapes and vines, you may know, are the Christological symbols of the blood of Christ, if you think of drinking sacramental wine during Mass. So it also recalls the tree of Jesse, which is a metaphor for the genealogical tree of Christ, basically who's Christ descended from. He's descended from Old Testament prophets, especially King David. So all of these elements are connected. There's not a single thing that's chosen randomly. Written on the wall over here on the left side, you can see it above the altar, is the last word that Jesus said before he died, translated into Slovene: "It is done, dopoljeno." Behind this monolithic stone tabernacle, representing the tomb, is this large golden circle that you can see, representing the sun that rose on the third day after his death and indicates his resurrection. And then we have this fun little punchline. So it's an art historical tradition that it's good to try, but it's tricky to represent the Holy Trinity, which is theoretically complicated. You have God, the Father, Jesus is the Son, and the Holy Spirit, usually in the form of a dove. And all three are unified, but they're also three separate entities. And it's theologically complicated. And artists have come up with different ways to represent this complication. And for me, I think it works out well here. If you have this idea that because we're in a church, God is all around us, and if you have this idea that Christ is there in the form of the crucifix, then you might wonder where the third component of the Holy Trinity is, the Holy Spirit, usually shown in the form of a white dove. And you have to play hide and seek a little bit, and that's what's fun. But if you look around enough, you can actually find it. And you have to find it only on your way out, just as you're leaving. Where is it? It is here. You can see in the bottom on the right side. It's on the doorknob of the door you came into when you went into the chapel. So you're only going to spot it when you reach for the doorknob to leave the chapel. I think this is great fun. And nobody said that artists and architects can't have a sense of humor and put fun things into their work. So to me, this is the most complex and complete of his works of art, and we're very lucky to have it in Kamniku. So just to conclude, Plečnik was the ideal postmodern architect. His work was full of temporal contradictions, ambiguity, individuality, and intellectual self-consciousness as an artist. Those are all things we associate with postmodernism. He was neither the product of his time nor the exemplar of it. His combined use of classical elements, historicism, theories like that of Gottfried Semper, who I mentioned, melded with contemporary concepts like secessionism and some elements of functionalism and modernism. It's perhaps ironic that postmodernism saw in Plečnik its admiration for personal, subjective preference. What I want as an artist is what postmodern artists are all about, over the modernist search for objective absolute truths in architecture. So the modernists would say there's a way that architecture should be, and we should all adhere to it. And starting in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, postmodernists said it's all about individuals making their own decisions and not having to explain it to anyone. Plečnik certainly did make subjective decisions outside of movements and his time, but throughout he stated that he was doing it while in search of what he called an absolute architecture that he thought must be bound up in classicism. In the process of seeking out the modernist ideal of something that's socially beneficial, that's one of the modernist concepts, that architecture shouldn't just be for the wealthy, it shouldn't be just about itself, but it should help people in some way, whether it's charitable, like Plečnik said that he thought every new apartment building should contain one free apartment for a poor family, or the idea that living in a good building will elevate you morally, intellectually, however you like. Plečnik followed his own path and drew praise from postmodernists for doing so. Plečnik's national critical renown was thanks to the writings of the first Slovene art historians who championed him, while his international recognition came from foreign postmodernists who took him posthumously, so they found him many decades after he died under their wing. This year is the centenary of his birth, and it's a great time to visit any of his buildings, to think more about him and to admire what he created. He was more than just an architect. He created everything from candles to industrial design, chairs. He had a favorite tea. You can get Plečnik tea, you name it. He's really was a universal figure. And to me, he is the very best of Slovenian artists, full stop, of any period at all. So I'm delighted if this has given you a little bit more insight into him. I hope it's been fun. Hope you're still in your pajamas with your cup of Plečnik tea handy. If you're interested, I have lots of books that are Slovenia related. Here are some of them. A couple of them just came out. On the left is a book that I wrote with my friend, the Slovenian artist Jasha, about behind the scenes, how to make it as a contemporary artist. On the right-hand side, I wrote the text for Janez Bratož JB's cookbook, which just came out with an American publisher, and which won 5 awards, all for design and photographs. Still waiting for an award for that text, but it's a very, very beautiful book. and you can order those on Amazon. And if you're interested, I have a book that I wrote with my friend Micha Mazzini, illustrated by my fellow Kamnik resident, Ivan Matrevski, that you can order from the website at the bottom. It's called Skrivna zgodovina Slovenije. It's only available in Slovene, and it's a satirical illustrated history of Slovenia. Then, of course, Slovenology. And coming up next this year, there's going to be Slovenology 2, Kulturologia, Culturology. So stay tuned. If you're interested, you can always write me via social media. Is probably the easiest way to do so. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I would be happy to answer a few questions if anyone has them. The easiest for me would be if you write them in the chat, but if you prefer to ask them in person, we can also do that. I see one question. Could you translate Stimmung with sentiment? Sort of, but it's less about emotion and more, it's a vibe that begins with an aesthetic, I think. So maybe the sentiment produced by seeing something. I don't know, there's lots of words that it's hard to translate. German especially has lots of compound words that go on for a very long time, and we don't have a really good direct translation for it. I usually say, especially to Slovene students, that you're not allowed to leave unless I have 3 questions, because Slovenes don't want to ask questions. We already have some expats willing to ask questions. I appreciate that. Okay, so are there any current architects in Slovenia that are inspired by Plečnik? I think probably most contemporary Slovenian architects are at least looking to Plečnik and tipping their hat to him. I have an article that will be in English in my culturology book, but is only in Slovene now, that came out with RTV, which on the RTV website, which is basically about my thoughts on contemporary Slovenian architecture and architects. And so an English version will come out then. Otherwise, if you go to the RTV website and search for my name, it's in one of my columns there if you can read Slovene. And I picked, I think, like 20 contemporary architects who I liked particularly. And there's a slideshow, and I talked about what I liked about them. But I think it's like, can you have a German composer who doesn't have some inspiration from, Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart? Probably not. Okay. Yeah, the relationship with Alice Masaryk, it is intriguing. There has been writing about Plečnik's relationship with Emilia Fon, because their letters to one another are still around. With Alice Masaryk, I basically didn't look into his personal life too much, but I think in biographies of Alice Masaryk, you can probably find out more. But it seems like they were a romantic item for a brief period of time, and Alice was wanting to marry him, perhaps, and he was already married to architecture, thank you very much. So he was busy just kissing her so she would faint, and then nothing else came out of it. These are great questions. We only need, well, we already had 3 technically. Is there anyone else who would like to ask one while we're here?
We have one question, Mr.
Hello, can you see me?
I can't, but that's okay. I can hear you.
Doesn't matter. You can hear me. Is that right?
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Dragan. I'm from Ljubljana. I read your book, and I must say that when I started reading your book about Plečnik, I was a little puzzled, because I didn't really agree with what you were writing about, but then it came more into me, and I tried to see your perspective, your distance, because you're a foreigner. You did it different, and then I liked it more and more and more. And I would like to meet you in person. One day I will find the way, and I would like to talk about these things. I also have some plans and some visions about Plečnik's works. And I have no questions. Thank you very much for what you gave to us.
That's very kind. Thank you so much. And I appreciate that. That's actually a good sign. If at first you're like, what's this guy talking about? Because it doesn't sound quite right to you, but you digest it and decide maybe there's something to it. I think that's a good sign. So thank you for that comment. Another question, some cities that don't have historical landmarks build modern ones, and yes, they certainly do. Some place like Dubai or Hamburg. Should Ljubljana build something? I think they should. I think that somebody thought that the new stadium was going to be that building, but it's just not a good enough building. And it's a shame. It looks too much like a clamshell, and it's a missed opportunity. So I think, yes, but I think it would be great. I don't think that they should do what a lot of cities do, which is hire one of these international celebrity architects. Like, you don't want a Zaha Hadid or a Frank Gehry swooping in and making a building that would get a lot of press and would be cool looking, but isn't of the place. I think it should be as Slovenian as possible and using a local architect, not an international celebrity architect. And I think it would be frankly cool to make the Cathedral of Freedom. Maybe a different twist on it. Maybe it wouldn't be exactly that. Maybe it would be a building that would reference it. But, you know, Bilbao has shown us that great architecture can transform cities and make them tourist attractions when they were of no interest to tourists before. And when the Guggenheim Bilbao was built by Frank Gehry, a city that people were not interested in visiting as a tourist suddenly became a destination. So I think it would be a really good investment for a place like Ljubljana. But you have to have the balls to go for a design that is hit or miss and that not everybody's going to like, but a lot of people are going to think is amazing and talk about. And that isn't usually how Slovenian public funds are allocated. They're usually allocated in a way that's like, okay, and is going to get the fewest people upset, but isn't particularly remarkable or effective. Okay, can you type the name of the church in Kamnik? It's the Franciscan Church, and it's just behind the main street. I think is it Sveti Jakub? I don't even know. I can't remember the name. No, Sveti Jakub is a different one. It's the church that has a monastery. It's got this really great library of rare books in it as well. And it's parallel to the main street in Kamnik. Like if you walked out of the town hall and jumped over a bunch of buildings, you would land on it. It's also got a world-class rare books library that nobody knows about, nobody visits because you have to call ahead and a cute monk has to show you around, but it's completely amazing. It's one of those hidden things that you need people to tell you about. Yes, thank you for your Franciscani church. There you go. Okay. What was Plečnik's teaching style? It was Socratic. He would ask questions and ask questions and ask provocative questions and try to basically get people to trip over their own assumptions. And it was otherwise quite casual, and he would sit around in his own home and host his favorite students. And he really seemed very protective of his favorite students and had good relationships with them. The mosque I think the mosque is probably the best building in Slovenia, the best new building. It's completely wonderful. So that is one. And it's a little bit random because it doesn't feel Slovene. It just feels like a really great building. But it's very beautiful and definitely should be visited. Maybe one more. All right, thank you so much for spending your evening with me. It's a delight to be able to chat with you. And I'm already in my pajamas, so I'm just going to go put children to bed. But thank you so much for your time and attention. And if you want to be in touch, just write me via social media. Otherwise, thank you so much and best wishes.
Bye. Bye. Hvala lepa.
Hvala.